Hey friends, this is Lynn from Right For You, and we're talking about launching your podcast and what you need to know. And this is part 2. And this week we're going to talk about evergreen or episodic podcast. Which one should you choose? Solo or interview? Which one should you choose? And last week I had part 1 and I talked about how to pick your name, what your idea and your genre for your podcast. If you haven't listened to that, definitely listen to that. And also like and subscribe to my channel so that you can get some more podcasting information. All right. So part 2 is all about episodic or evergreen. So what do these mean? Like episodic, you might know, because if you read books, and most of us do, that you might know what an episode is, or you watch TV, you know what an episode is. So episodic means that you have one episode come out one week and the next week is a following episode. Sometimes it's a follow-up or it's a standalone. So episodic is just each episode of your podcast. And that also is that when you do episodic podcasts, that means that the person that is listening needs to listen to them in order for them to understand, right? So like when you have TV episodes, right? If you don't watch, like if you are watching Friends and you start watching at season 8, well, you've got 7 seasons of context that you didn't get. So you're not going to understand everything that's going on in season 8 or even season 3 because you're missing context. They're episodic. So for an episodic podcast, or it's podcasts that like are story based, or maybe you have a crime show and the person has to listen to episode 1, season 1 before they listen to episode 2 in season 1, because if they don't listen to episode 1, they're not going to understand the information in episode 2. So that's what an episodic podcast is that you have to listen to them in a certain order to understand. Now, it doesn't have to be, you have to listen to all of season 1 and then all of season 2. So it can be like that, but it doesn't have to. It might just be for season 1, you have to listen to season 1 in order. For season 2, you need to listen to season 2 in order. And so that's really important to know if you want to do an episodic podcast or not. Okay, the next type of podcast is evergreen, and evergreen is what all of my podcasts are. And what that simply means is that like an evergreen tree is green all year, no matter what episode your listener comes in. It could be 500, it can be 20, it does not matter. That they can just start listening to whatever episode they choose because it doesn't need to make sense. Like they don't need to listen to the previous episode in order for that episode to make sense. Now there is exceptions, like if you have a part 1 and part 2 to your podcast, for an episode, then for 2 episodes, then yes, they would most likely have to listen to part 1 to understand what part 2 is referring to in context. But for the most part, your evergreen podcast is that they can jump in at episode 50, they can jump in at episode 150. No matter where they jump in, they can just listen to any episode in any order and understand what you're talking about on your show. So that's what evergreen is. So evergreen, they can jump in any episode. Episodic, you have to listen to them in a certain order. Then there's also solo or interview. People are like, should I do solo or should I do interview? Well, actually, you don't have to choose one. You can do both. And all of my podcasts are both solo and interview. Why would I do all of my podcasts both? Well, for several different reasons. One is because solo episodes are easier to produce because it's just you talking on a microphone. So that's much easier to produce than getting somebody to like making calendars and your production schedule. Well, you should have a production schedule if you do solo, either way, but you have to keep your production schedule. And then on top of that, you have to schedule interviews and follow up with people and make sure your cloud calendar is in place and fill in the blank and have an interview form and all this stuff. And so it definitely puts a more larger complication and level of work, more detailed work that you need to be involved if you're doing interviews. However, interviews really expand your network. So if you're looking to expand your network of business network or companies or other people, podcasting is a great way to do that. And interview shows are the way to do that. If you're looking to be seen as an expert in your field, then solo shows are a great way to show off your expertise in your field, no matter what field that is. So I do a mix of both because I want my listeners to see me as an expert in my field. And I also want to expand my network by inviting people who I wouldn't have contacted otherwise, but I'm contacting them to come and be on my podcast. And almost everybody who I have contacted was very happy to be on my podcast. And so one thing you do have to be careful of is that when you start your podcast and it starts to get, you start getting a lot of episodes underway, people will discover your podcast and will want to be on it. Everybody and their grandmothers sisters, brothers, cousins, nephew will email you to be on your podcast. It is okay to say no. And it is okay to charge people who email you to be on their podcast, because many times they have a book, and the best way for people that have a self-published book or a published book to market it is through podcasting. So if you want to charge because this is your time, that is perfectly fine. You can charge for people asking you. My general rule of thumb is that if I'm asking somebody, I'm not going to charge them to be on my podcast. But if they're asking me to be on my podcast, I will charge them what I call an application fee. So they have to pay that fee and then they get the application and then they fill it out. And I, ask them ahead of time, like what they want to talk about, because whatever the topic is, I has to add value to my podcast. If what somebody wants to come on and isn't in my specific niche, then it's not a good fit. And I will say, thank you, but this isn't something that my audience would value from hearing. I mean, they might in a different podcast, but that's not my specialty. So I really try to stick to gluten-free travel and of course, gluten-free foods and products and brands that are good to travel with. And so that's really important for me as a podcaster, because that upholds your integrity. If you start going all over the place willy-nilly with like, oh, here's a little bit tougher here and like, once a month or twice a month, then you're going to lose followers because people are looking for your sub niche. Remember that sub niche I talked about in the last video. If you didn't watch it, go back and watch it. That sub niche is so super important, because that sub niche that you picked are really dedicated followers, and they want to hear that sub niche that you promised them. So make sure that you have that. And if every once in a while you go a little off topic, that's fine, but you don't want to do it on a regular basis, because then you're going to lose your crowd for sure. And if you have a different topic you want to talk about, you can always start a second podcast or a third, like I did. So anyway, if you need any help with your podcasting and you need help getting launched, or you just need an hour with a podcast professional to help walk you through some questions that you have, I'd be glad to help. Go over to writefforyou.me and click on the contact tab, and then you can schedule a 15-minute complimentary consult with me and be happy to see if we are a good fit to work together. All right, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video. Stop back next week for part 3 of checklist for starting your podcast, and that is going to be choosing a host for your show.